someone, released this on purpose. That's the part that keeps researchers up at night. Not the footage itself, though trust me, we're going to get to that. But the deliberate, calculated decision by someone still wearing a uniform, still drawing a military paycheck, still bound by a security clearance they swore to protect, to let this out. They didn't leak it in a panic. They didn't accidentally email the wrong person. This was intentional, methodical, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were risking. So before we talk about what's on that footage and what the military's own internal documentation says about it, I need you to understand something first. The story here isn't just about what was filmed, it's about why, for years, you were never supposed to see it, and why suddenly someone decided that needed to change. Because when governments classify footage, most of us assume it's about embarrassment. A failed weapons test, a friendly fire incident, something politically inconvenient that'll blow over in a news cycle. And sometimes, that's exactly what it is. But there's another category, a smaller, quieter category of recordings that get sealed not because they're embarrassing, but because the people in charge genuinely don't know how to explain what's on them. And that category, that's where this footage lives. Let me take you back to how this started. The recording itself didn't surface on a whistleblower site. It didn't show up in a journalist's inbox with an anonymous tip. What happened was stranger than that. A small number of analysts working within a defense-contracted research group received what appeared to be an internal data package, formatted exactly like a standard declassification transfer. Proper headers, proper authentication codes, legitimate chain of custody documentation going back years. Everything Lowe said, okayed. Completely normal, except for one thing. Nobody had authorized the release. Dr. Carla Mendenhall, a former signals intelligence analyst who spent 11 years working with classified media at a government level before transitioning to independent research, described the situation in a recorded interview. She said, and I'm quoting directly here, "The package didn't come through back channels, it came through the front door. That's what made it so unsettling. Whoever sent it knew the system well enough to make it look completely routine." Think about what that means for a moment. This wasn't someone fumbling around in the dark, copying files onto a USB drive. This was someone, or a group of someones, with deep institutional knowledge. Someone who understood exactly how declassified materials move through a bureaucratic pipeline and used that knowledge, precisely, to move something that was never supposed to move at all. Now, to really understand why this matters, you need to understand what classified actually means in practice, because it's not what most people think. We throw that word around like it's one thing, classified. But inside the defense and intelligence communities, classification is a layered architecture. You've got your standard tiers, confidential, secret, top secret, and most people have at least a vague sense of those. But beyond top secret, things get significantly more complicated. There are compartmentalized programs, special access programs, SAPs, that exist essentially as their own sovereign bubbles within the larger intelligence structure. People with top secret clearance don't automatically have access to SAP material. You have to be read in, specifically, deliberately, on a need-to-know basis, to even know a particular program exists. Dr. James Whitfield, a defense policy analyst at Georgetown University who has consulted for multiple congressional oversight committees, explained it this way. The public imagines classification as a vault. Something is either inside or outside. The reality is more like a series of nested rooms, and the people in the outer rooms have no idea what's happening in the inner ones. This footage, based on the authentication documentation that came with it, originated from inside one of those inner rooms. Which brings us to the question of how it was captured in the first place, and the answer to that is where things start to get genuinely unusual. The recording wasn't taken by a single camera. It was captured simultaneously across multiple sensor platforms, visual, thermal, and radar, aboard a naval vessel operating in a designated exercise corridor. The date has been partially redacted in the released materials, but cross-referencing with ship deployment records and publicly available maritime tracking data, independent investigators have narrowed it to a window of roughly 14 months spanning late 2021 into early 2023. The location, a stretch of ocean in the Pacific, is significant, and we'll come back to why. Here's what the footage shows. And I want to be careful here, because I want to describe this accurately, not sensationally. The primary visual feed shows an object, and I'm using that word deliberately because that's the word used in the accompanying incident report, moving at a consistent altitude above the water surface. At first glance, if you're watching casually, you might not think much of it. It's small in the frame. The ocean is calm. The object appears to be traveling at a reasonable speed, nothing obviously alarming, but then you look at the data overlay. Because this camera system wasn't operating alone, running simultaneously was a forward-looking infrared system, FLIR, buoy, and what that thermal feed showed was not consistent with what the visual feed showed at all. The object on the visual camera appears to be moving smoothly, steadily, in a straight line. The thermal signature, the heat profile, is jumping, not randomly, but in a pattern, discrete, repeating, like something cycling or pulsing. Dr. Renata Okafor, an aerospace engineer with a background in propulsion systems who reviewed the released sensor data independently, said this in a written analysis published through the aerospace research collective she leads. The thermal profile doesn't correspond to any known propulsion method I'm familiar with. Jet combustion, ion drive, electric propulsion. None of them produce this specific signature pattern. The closest analogy in terms of pulse rhythm would be a magnetohydrodynamic system, but the energy levels implied by the signature would be, well, they'd be remarkable. And that's just the thermal data. The radar returns. And this is the part that the Pentagon's official statement quietly glosses over. Showed the object performing what analysts call a high-G directional change. A turn. Sharp enough that if there were a human pilot inside whatever this was, they would have experienced forces that no living person can survive. We're talking about the kind of acceleration that turns biology into something else entirely. The kind of maneuver that our most advanced aircraft cannot perform. Not won't. Can't. The physics don't allow it. Now, wait. Before you go anywhere with that, I want to be clear. There are conventional explanations that get floated for anomalous radar data. Atmospheric ducting, signal interference, equipment malfunction. Legitimate scientists raise these possibilities, and they're right to raise them. Dr. Whitfield, who I mentioned earlier, is careful to say that sensor artifacts account for a significant percentage of UAP reports. That's true. That's important context. But here's the thing. Here's what makes this particular case different from a rogue radar blip. 3 separate crew members aboard the vessel submitted individual incident reports within 72 hours of the encounter. Not together, separately, without coordinating their accounts. And the details in those 3 reports align. Not perfectly, which would actually be more suspicious, but in the way that genuine eyewitness accounts align. The broad strokes match. The specifics differ slightly. The emotional language in all 3 reports RTS is consistent. One of the officers, whose name remains redacted in the released documents, wrote, and I'm reading from the actual text here, object maintained position relative to vessel movement for approximately 4 minutes before accelerating out of visual range. No sound was detected at any point. No exhaust, no wake, no observable means of propulsion. 4 minutes. Just think about that. This wasn't a split-second anomaly. This wasn't something that flashed across the horizon and disappeared before anyone could be sure what they saw. This was a 4-minute sustained observation by trained military personnel, supported by multiple simultaneous sensor systems, of something that none of them could identify. And all 3 officers, all 3, were quietly reassigned within 90 days of filing their reports. Now, reassignment happens. It's military life. People get moved around. But the pattern here is what independent researchers flagged as notable. Because when journalist and defense accountability researcher Marcus Teller, who has spent 6 years filing FOIA requests specifically related to UAP incident documentation, cross-referenced the reassignment dates with the incident report timestamps, he found something he described as a clustering that's difficult to attribute to coincidence. Every personnel move happened after, not before, the formal incident reports were logged into the system. In other words, the system saw the reports, and then the people who filed them moved. Let me back up for a second, because I want to make sure we're giving the skeptical view its full due here, because it deserves it. The Pentagon, in their official statement, which runs to exactly 3 paragraphs, attributed what the crew observed to a combination of sensor calibration anomalies and atmospheric conditions consistent with the operating environment. That's the official position. And to be fair, atmospheric conditions in open ocean environments can do genuinely strange things to sensor readings, mirages, temperature inversions. These are real phenomena with real scientific grounding. But here's where it gets complicated. And I mean that in a very specific, technical sense. Dr. Okafor's analysis. And she was not alone. She was part of a small independent review that included 2 former NASA propulsion researchers and a physicist from Caltech. Identified 4 specific claims embedded in the Pentagon's atmospheric conditions explanation that are, in their words, physically inconsistent with the documented data. Not just unlikely, not just improbable, inconsistent. Meaning, if the data is accurate, the explanation cannot be, and if the explanation is accurate, then the sensor data is wrong. Every piece of it, simultaneously, across multiple independent systems. The probability of that, of total multi-system failure producing coherent, patterned, consistent false readings, is not 0. But it approaches it. And here's what makes the historical context of this so significant. Because this footage isn't emerging in a vacuum. What we're looking at, and this is something that serious defense researchers have been pointing out for years, is the latest instance in a pattern. A documented, cross-referenced, decades-long pattern of similar encounters, similar sensor signatures, and similar institutional responses. The Wilson-Davis Memo. The Navy's own UAP Task Force reports from 2020 and 2021. The Declassified AA-TIP program documentation. The USS Nimitz encounter in 2004. The USS Roosevelt encounters in 2014 and 2015. The details vary. The geometry of the objects differs. The locations differ. The specific sensor anomalies differ. But certain signatures repeat. The absence of propulsion noise, the thermal irregularities, the radar behavior, and, consistently, the institutional response of minimization followed by reassignment. Dr. Helena Strauss, who holds a joint appointment in history and security studies at Johns Hopkins and has written extensively on the declassification of Cold War intelligence programs, makes an observation that I think is worth sitting with. She said, "Institutions don't systematically minimize things that don't worry them. The more consistent and deliberate the minimization effort, the more confident you can be that someone somewhere took what was observed seriously. Bureaucracies don't spend resources suppressing things they consider irrelevant." Read that again slowly, because it reframes the entire question. If none of this was real, if these were all just sensor glitches and weather phenomena and misidentified aircraft, then the appropriate institutional response is nothing. You file it. You note the equipment issue. You move on. You don't reassign officers. You don't classify multi-sensor data packages at compartmentalized access levels. You don't write 3-paragraph statements with 4 physically inconsistent claims. You just don't care. The effort to minimize is itself evidence of something. Now? Why is this footage surfacing in this particular window of time? And I want to be really precise about this because the timing it's not random, and the people paying attention to defense policy are noticing. In the months just preceding this footage's release, 2 things happened in fairly quick succession. First, a closed session of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Closed meaning no public record, no press, no C-SPAN, took place, and multiple senators who attended described it afterward in terms that ranged from sobering to genuinely alarming. None of them elaborated publicly. They were apparently not legally permitted to. Second, a classified budget amendment was passed, directing a not publicly specified allocation to what the amendment language called unexplained aerial phenomena, analysis, and response infrastructure. The dollar figure was redacted. The receiving agency was redacted. The scope of the mandate was redacted. And then, weeks later, this footage appears. Packaged correctly. Authenticated correctly. Moving through the proper channels. As if it belonged there. Marcus Teller, the defense accountability researcher I mentioned earlier, put it directly. Either someone inside the system decided the public needed to see this before something larger becomes undeniable, or this release is itself a calculated disclosure. Either way, Someone made a decision, and that decision was made at a level where people understand what's coming next. That phrase, "what's coming next," is the part that stays with you. Because if you follow the thread of everything we've covered, the footage, the sensor data, the thermal signatures that don't correspond to known propulsion, the radar returns showing impossible acceleration, the 3 officers reassigned after filing consistent independent reports, the official statement with 4 physically impossible claims, the historical pattern of identical institutional responses, the Senate session that left senior lawmakers visibly shaken, the classified budget amendment for unexplained aerial infrastructure. If you follow that whole thread, then the footage itself, as strange as it is, starts to feel like the least remarkable part of the story. What's remarkable is the architecture around it, the system that held it, the decision to release it, the timing of that decision, and the quiet, deliberate way in which, piece by piece, a picture is being assembled, not by outsiders pushing against the institution, by people inside the institution, who appear to have concluded that the time for holding this back has passed. There are things we still don't know, significant things. The identity of whoever authorized this release, or whoever executed it, remains unknown. The full sensor data package, beyond what's been publicly discussed, has not been released. The 3 officers who filed incident reports have not spoken. The Senate committee members who attended that closed session have not elaborated. The classified budget amendment's receiving agency has not been identified. But here is what we do know. Something was captured on multiple simultaneous sensor systems, visual, thermal, radar, that performed in ways inconsistent with known technology. Multiple trained observers reported it independently and consistently. The official explanation for that recording contains claims that independent aerospace researchers have identified as physically impossible. The personnel who reported the incident were subsequently reassigned. The footage was classified at a compartmentalized level and then released deliberately by someone with institutional access during a window of time that coincides with significant closed-door congressional activity and a classified infrastructure budget amendment. That is, not nothing. That is a collection of documented cross-referenceable facts that don't resolve into a comfortable, simple answer. Dr. Mendenhall, the former signals intelligence analyst, said something in that same recorded interview that I keep coming back to. She said, "The question people always ask is, do you believe it's real? And I always give the same answer. I don't think belief is the right frame. What? RK, I think the right question is, what does the evidence require us to take seriously? And on that question, I don't think serious people can look at this dataset and conclude that there's nothing here worth examining. What does the evidence require us to take seriously?" I've been thinking about that framing for a while now, because it cuts through the noise in both directions. It's not asking you to believe anything. It's not asking you to dismiss anything. It's asking you to look at what's actually documented and follow it honestly wherever it leads. And honestly, where it leads is somewhere that mainstream discourse hasn't fully caught up to yet. Not because the information isn't there, but because sitting with real uncertainty, genuine, unresolved, this might matter uncertainty, is uncomfortable in a way that both full belief and full dismissal manage to avoid. The footage exists. The sensor data exists. The incident reports exist. The reassignments happened. The Senate session happened. The budget amendment happened. The release, deliberate, authenticated, unexplained, happened. What we do with that is the question nobody in authority is willing to answer right now. But here's what I'll leave you with. The person who decided to release this footage, whoever they are, wherever they are right now, made a choice, at significant personal risk, knowing exactly what they were releasing and exactly what it meant. They didn't send it to a conspiracy forum. They didn't post it anonymously online. They packaged it correctly, authenticated it properly, and moved it through the legitimate system. Because they wanted it to be taken seriously. They wanted you to take it seriously. And maybe, that's the most important detail in this entire story. Not what's on the footage, but the fact that someone, somewhere inside the apparatus that kept it hidden, decided that you deserve to see it. Whatever comes next, Whatever the next disclosure is, whatever that classified budget is building, whatever those senators heard in that closed room that left them choosing their words so carefully, it's coming. And when it does, you'll have the context to understand it.